August 17, 1943. The skies above Schweinfurt, Germany. The sun burns through a haze of smoke and vapor trails, glinting off silver wings that seem impossibly still in the thin air. 8 miles below, the target, the beating heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry, waits beneath a shroud of anti-aircraft fire. High above, 30,000 feet of frost and fear. Inside one of the lead bombers, sweat beads on oxygen masks. Engines hum at full throttle, their vibrations steady as a heartbeat. The radio crackles. Bandits 9 o'clock high. Dark specks appear on the horizon. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbing fast. German pilots smirk through their goggles. The Americans are slow, heavy, easy prey. They've seen these flying fortresses before. Big targets. Big talk. But as they dive in, something unexpected happens. The sky erupts. Streams of 50 caliber tracers crisscrossing in perfect geometry. Bombers stagger but hold formation. One fortress burns. Another stays aloft. Then another. The Germans pull back stunned. The fortress hasn't fallen. It's still flying straight for Schweinfurt. The legend of the flying fortress had just begun. By 1943, the air war over Europe had entered a new and merciless phase. The Allies had landed in North Africa and were pushing through Italy. But the heart of Nazi Germany, its factories, its oil, its lifelines, still beat untouched deep within the Reich. Britain's Royal Air Force struck by night, lighting up cities from Hamburg to Essen in waves of incendiary fire. Yet the Americans, newly arrived and untested, believed in a different kind of war. They would fight by day. It was a doctrine born from precision, mathematics, and faith in machines. Where the RAF's bombers cloaked themselves in darkness, the United States Army Air Forces trusted technology, bomb sights, formation discipline, and sheer firepower. Theirs was a mission of daylight accuracy, destroy the specific arteries of German industry and force its collapse from within. To do that, they needed an aircraft unlike any before. That aircraft was the Boeing B-17, the Flying Fortress. Conceived in the mid-1930s, it was designed not as a graceful machine of speed, but as an armored spearhead of endurance. With its 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, a wingspan of over 100 feet, and a maximum bomb load exceeding 4,000 pounds, the B-17 embodied the American belief that the sky could be conquered through engineering. Its name came from a Seattle journalist who, watching the prototype roll out in 1935, bristling with machine guns, remarked, "It's a flying fortress." The name stuck. The fortress carried up to 13 50 caliber Browning machine guns, mounted in chin, nose, dorsal, waist, and tail turrets, giving it an overlapping dome of fire that could strike attackers from any direction. In theory, a group of fortresses flying in tight formation could defend one another, weaving a sky of lead that no fighter could penetrate. By 1942, the 8th Air Force had brought this theory to Britain. From bases scattered across East Anglia, Bassingbourn, Thurley, and Thorpe Abbotts, American crews trained to fly in perfect combat boxes, stacked and staggered for mutual defense. Their goal, cripple the Reich's industrial core in broad daylight and bring the war home to Hitler. But the Luftwaffe was waiting. German Fighter Command, the Jagdwaffe, was battle-hardened, aggressive, and confident. Since 1939, their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s had dominated the skies of Europe. To them, these heavy, slow American bombers seemed an invitation. Their tactics were precise and lethal. Dive from above, strike the lead bomber, and scatter the formation. The early missions of 1942 proved costly. Without long-range escorts, the B-17s were forced to fight their way in and out of enemy territory alone. They faced the full fury of flak batteries and interceptors the moment they crossed the channel. Casualties climbed fast. Crews were told that completing 25 missions would earn them a ticket home. Few believed they'd live that long. Yet the American commanders, led by General Ira C. Eaker, refused to abandon their doctrine. They believed that daylight precision bombing could break Germany's industrial spine. If the fortresses could just survive long enough to prove it, every raid became a test, not only of aircraft, but of conviction. The sky over occupied Europe was a crucible where technology, courage, and theory collided. By the summer of 1943, the fortresses had begun to strike deep inside Germany, hitting shipyards in Bremen, aircraft plants in Regensburg, and ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. These were not random targets. They were chosen with surgical intent. Ball bearings were the lifeblood of every machine in the German war economy. Destroy them and tanks would stall, planes would remain grounded, and production would collapse. But there was a cost. Each deep raid stretched the limits of endurance. Crews flew for 8 to 10 hours at altitudes where frostbitten fingers froze to gun barrels. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen masks iced over, and flak bursts filled the cockpit with shards of glass and steel. Still, they flew on. The faith in the fortress and in the idea that bravery and engineering could defy the odds kept them airborne. The Germans mocked them at first, calling the American strategy suicidal optimism. But as reports of entire Luftwaffe squadrons being repelled by disciplined formations began to circulate, that mockery turned to concern. Something about these bombers was different. They didn't scatter, they didn't break, and soon, a confrontation unlike any before would test both that machine and the men inside it over the skies of Schweinfurt. When the first waves of American bombers crossed into occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe viewed them with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. German intelligence reports described the B-17 as slow but sturdy, a threat only if escorted. In the summer of 1942, when the early 8th Air Force raids reached targets in France and the Low Countries, they faced limited resistance. German commanders were still prioritizing the Eastern Front, where the war with the Soviet Union consumed men, aircraft, and fuel. But by early 1943, the pattern of daylight American raids had become impossible to ignore. At Luftwaffe III headquarters in Paris, senior officers debated the threat. General Adolf Galland, the famed fighter ace, warned that the Americans were not simply conducting nuisance raids. Their precision strikes against submarine pens and aircraft assembly plants were systematic, each one eroding the machinery of war. Galland understood that if these raids reached deep into Germany itself, the results could be catastrophic. The German response evolved quickly. The Luftwaffe began concentrating its fighter units, Jagdgeschwader, along the bomber routes. Aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109G and the Focke-Wulf 190A were fitted with heavier armament, 20mm and 30mm cannons designed to tear through bomber formations with single, devastating bursts. Tactics shifted too. Early head-on attacks, though risky, proved most effective. Bombers presented smaller frontal targets, but a well-aimed cannon burst into the cockpit or nose could annihilate an entire crew. Other formations used vertical dives or climbing turns, relying on speed to slice through the defensive screen before gunners could react. And yet, the Americans adapted just as quickly. In East Anglia's cold morning airfields, crews practiced flying in combat boxes, staggered formations that maximized fields of fire. Each gunner covered another bomber's blind spot. The geometry was brutal and efficient. When German fighters dove in, they met a wall of interlocking tracers. Luftwaffe pilots nicknamed it the Flying Porcupine. Still, the cost was immense on both sides. Every mission saw dozens of fortresses lost, spiraling down in black smoke over the Channel or the fields of France. For each bomber destroyed, 10 men vanished from the roster, dead, captured, or missing. On the German side, attrition began to gnaw as well. Experienced fighter aces, men with hundreds of victories, were dying at alarming rates. Each loss weakened the core of skill that had carried Germany's air superiority since 1939. The Luftwaffe training schools could no longer replace them fast enough. By the spring of 1943, both sides understood that the air war was no longer a series of raids, it was an industrial duel for the future of Europe. American planners inside the mighty 8th headquarters in High Wycombe faced a strategic gamble. Without long-range fighter escort, their fortresses remained vulnerable beyond the range of British Spitfires and early Thunderbolts. Yet every delay gave Germany time to recover. General Eaker's staff concluded that only deep, repeated strikes could cripple the German industrial heart. Targets were chosen with surgical precision: Regensburg's Messerschmitt factories, the marshalling yards of Schweinfurt, the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, and the submarine yards at Kiel. The logic was cold: hit the vital organs, and the Reich's war machine would collapse. Meanwhile, in German airfields scattered across France and Belgium, mechanics worked through the night-loading cannons, testing engines and fueling interceptors for the dawn alarms. The sound of B-17 engines was becoming familiar and ominous. Radar stations along the Channel tracked their approach, relaying coordinates to waiting fighter wings. Pilots were briefed before dawn: altitude, heading, and expected formation size. They were told that the enemy could not sustain such losses for long, that the bombers were easy prey, that their armor could not resist the new 30mm shells. Confidence was high, but in the skies, theory met the unyielding reality of the fortress. Crews began reporting the same unnerving pattern. Fighters would dive in, score visible hits, and then watch in disbelief as the wounded bomber continued straight and level. One or two fortresses might go down, but the rest flew on, riddled, burning, yet unbroken. Many German pilots called it superstition, others engineering. Either way, the legend was spreading. The fortress refused to die. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the air war over Europe. Two forces, each believing in its own doctrine, German speed and precision versus American endurance and firepower, were about to collide head-on over Schweinfurt. The next chapter would show how that collision changed the balance of the skies forever. At 25,000 feet, war became mechanical, yet profoundly human. Every fortress carried 10 men, each with a defined task, each dependent on the others for survival. The pilot and co-pilot at the controls guiding 30 tons of metal through thin, frozen air. The navigator hunched over his charts, plotting bearings with trembling hands. The bombardier, waiting behind the plexiglass nose, watching the target drift into the crosshairs of the Norden bombsight. And all around them, the gunners. Their world was sound and vibration. The engines roared like distant thunder, the cabin shook, and the metal skin groaned under stress. When enemy fighters appeared, it was the gunners who spoke first, through the rhythm of their 50-caliber Brownings. Each gun's staccato song echoed across the formation, filling the sky with a heartbeat of defiance. Fear was ever present, but it took on a strange stillness. Veterans called it the long minute, the seconds before a fighter's attack. The flak bursts outside looked like black flowers blooming in the air, beautiful until one tore through the fuselage. Crews knew the odds. In 1943, a B-17 crewman's chance of surviving 25 missions was roughly 1 in 4, yet they flew morning after morning. Letters home spoke not of heroism, but of duty, of friends lost and the quiet belief that the fortress might somehow get them back. Inside these aircraft, courage was not loud. It was the calm act of loading another belt of ammunition while the plane burned around you. 2. Tactical angle, the geometry of survival. The daylight bombing campaign was not chaos. It was a ballet of precision. Every formation, every maneuver was governed by doctrine and mathematics. Crews called it the combat box. 3 squadrons formed a group and 3 groups formed a wing. Dozens of fortresses, staggered at precise altitudes and intervals. It was an airborne fortress wall, moving at 150 miles per hour. The logic was elegant. Each bomber protected the one beside it. A German fighter diving into the formation would face crossfire from 5 or 6 guns at once. At long range, the streams of tracers looked like glowing webs in the sky. Pilots learned to hold their line no matter what. Breaking formation meant death. If a bomber slipped out of place, it became an isolated target. German fighters circled like wolves, attacking stragglers from every angle. Many fortresses that fell never exploded. They simply lost speed, drifting down as their comrades continued forward, unable to break formation to help. Communication was minimal. Radio silence preserved coordination. Orders were passed with hand signals, light flashes, or the grim choreography of movement. To the Luftwaffe, this unity was maddening. Each raid was not a random collection of aircraft, but a disciplined machine. The tighter the Americans flew, the more dangerous they became. By mid-1943, German pilots realized the old methods, fast dives from the rear, were suicide. New tactics were born out of desperation. Head-on attacks, high-speed slashes, and coordinated frontal passes meant to tear open the formation before defensive fire could converge. The Americans countered with chin turrets and improved gun positions. Every new modification to the fortress was a lesson written in blood. 3. Technological angle. Why the fortress endured, though. B-17's legend was not myth. It was the product of engineering foresight and brutal testing. Its aluminum alloy skin was built around a semi-monocoque structure, meaning the aircraft's body itself bore the load. Damage that would have destroyed other bombers often left the fortress limping home. Redundancy was its secret. Multiple hydraulic systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust engine mounts allowed it to absorb punishment beyond expectation. Crews told stories of bombers landing with tails shredded, wings half torn or entire sections missing, still controllable, still flying. Each engine, a Wright R-1820, could operate independently. If one failed, the plane could fly on 3. If 2 failed, it could still maintain altitude for short periods. Even with massive structural damage, the fortress had an uncanny ability to hold together. Defensively, it was a porcupine of steel. Early models carried 7 guns. Later versions increased that to 13. The most critical upgrade came with the B-17G, introducing the powered chin turret to counter deadly frontal assaults. With overlapping arcs of fire, fortresses could protect one another in 360 degrees. For the Luftwaffe, this changed everything. German cannon shells often tore holes through the wings or fuselage, yet the bomber kept its shape. The Americans designed the internal layout so that cables, control lines, and critical systems were spaced apart, reducing the chance that a single hit could cripple the aircraft. From a distance, it looked cumbersome. Up close, it was a fortress in every sense. Even the Luftwaffe began to respect it. German pilots like Egon Meyer and Georg Peter Eder, both aces, developed specialized tactics to face it, evidence of how seriously they now regarded the machine they once mocked. The B-17's endurance became more than mechanical. It was psychological. Every fortress that returned home riddled with holes sent a silent message. The Americans would not be deterred. That endurance, both human and machine, set the stage for the defining clash of the air war, when both doctrines would be tested to breaking point. At the heart of the American daylight bombing campaign stood a single, unshakable belief. Precision could win wars. This doctrine came from General Henry Hap Arnold and the architects of the U.S. Army Air Forces, who argued that strategic bombing could cripple an enemy's war machine without the prolonged bloodshed of ground campaigns. Their confidence rested on 2 pillars, the Norden bomb site and the Flying Fortress. General Ira C. Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force in England, became its chief evangelist. His headquarters at High Wycombe was less a command post than a laboratory of persistence. Each morning, Eaker's intelligence officers spread reconnaissance photographs across the tables, rail yards, assembly plants, and fuel depots marked with red grease pencil. The message was consistent: strike their heart, not their soldiers. But this conviction came at a price. Every raid deep into Germany risked hundreds of aircraft and thousands of men. Eaker faced pressure from Washington and London alike, the British skeptical of daylight missions, the Americans eager for results. When Churchill warned that the American boys are dying in the daylight, Eaker replied calmly, so that fewer will have to die on the ground. Behind him stood a generation of commanders who shared that belief. Men like Curtis LeMay, the young group leader known for his icy discipline and mathematical precision. LeMay demanded perfection in formation flying and bomb delivery, punishing even minor deviations. His crews feared him, but they survived because of him. Leadership in the air war was not theatrical. It was logistical, relentless, and coldly focused. To the men of the 8th Air Force, orders were clear: hold formation, trust your fortress, and finish the mission, no matter the cost. 5. Enemy angle. The Luftwaffe's view from the cockpit. For the German pilots of 1943, the arrival of the Flying Fortress signaled a new kind of enemy, one that refused to play by the rules of air, Combat Major Egon Mayer of Jagdgeschwader II recalled his first encounter with a B-17 formation as attacking a wall. His 20mm cannon struck home, but the bombers didn't break. It was like shooting into a ship, he said later. Many Luftwaffe veterans began to notice the same pattern. Their rounds punched holes, shredded control surfaces, and even blew off engines. Yet the American formation kept flying. For every bomber that fell, another seemed to take its place, steady and implacable. Frustration turned to fascination. German intelligence units studied downed fortresses with forensic precision. Engineers crawled through the wreckage, noting armor plating, redundant wiring, and overlapping gunfields. Reports concluded that no single fighter could reliably destroy a fortress alone. It required coordinated squadron attacks, often from head-on. But these new tactics were perilous. A frontal pass at 400 miles per hour gave pilots mere seconds to aim and fire before colliding with their targets. Losses mounted. Even experienced aces began to fear the massive swarms of bombers that filled the sky. By mid-1943, German morale began to erode. Fuel shortages grew, spare parts dwindled, and new pilots arrived with only minimal training. The once dominant Luftwaffe was fighting not only the Americans, but also its own exhaustion. Inside briefing rooms, officers reassured their men that the bombers could not continue without crippling losses. Yet the Americans did continue, and each returning wave deepened the sense that the Luftwaffe's dominance was slipping away. 6. Moral and psychological angle. The War of Perception War. In the sky was as much about perception as destruction. In American newspapers, the fortress became a symbol of resilience. Headlines read, "Flying Fortresses Smash Nazi Industry," and photographs of bombers ho. 6. Moral and psychological angle. The War of Perception. War in the sky was as much about perception as destruction. In American newspapers, the fortress became a symbol of resilience. Headlines read, "Flying Fortresses Smash Nazi Industry," and photographs of bombers returning home with gaping holes in their fuselage captured the public imagination. Crews posed beside their wounded aircraft. Names like Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, and 909 painted boldly on the nose. Each one was a message of defiance sent across the Atlantic. Back in Germany, propaganda tried to counter the narrative. The Luftwaffe claimed inflated kill numbers, reporting that entire bomber groups had been annihilated, but German civilians soon saw the truth overhead. Hundreds of bombers passing in daylight, the sound of their engines rumbling across cities once thought unreachable. Morale on both sides hinged on these perceptions. For Americans, each successful mission validated the faith in technology and discipline. For Germans, each raid eroded the illusion of invulnerability. The fortress had become more than a weapon. It was psychological warfare in metal form. Even among Allied airmen, reverence grew. Ground crews spoke of the B-17 as if it were alive, a creature of aluminum and courage. They patched its wounds, counted bullet holes, and sent it back into the sky again. Some bombers flew over 100 missions, outlasting multiple crews. The moral dimension extended far beyond the battlefield. Strategic bombing carried ethical weight, the question of civilian casualties and the balance between necessity and destruction. Yet in 1943, amid the fires of total war, few doubted its purpose. Every city bombed and every factory destroyed brought the end closer. By the late summer of that year, all these angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, and moral, converged in one moment of truth. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions would test every belief both sides held about air power. The Germans would throw their best against the fortresses. The Americans would fly through a storm of fire to prove that daylight bombing could break the Reich. The battle that followed would become a turning point in the skies over Europe. Dawn broke cold over East Anglia on August 17, 1943. The airfields at Bassingbourn, Kimbolton, and Thorpe Abbott shimmered under a low mist as ground crews moved like ghosts through the hangars. Engines coughed to life one by one, the sound building into a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. It was the start of mission number 84, a coordinated strike on two of the most important industrial targets in Germany, Regensburg and Schweinfurt. To the Americans, it was an audacious plan. The 8th Air Force would split its bomber stream into two massive forces, one attacking the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, the other the vital ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The hope was to cripple both production centers in a single hammer-like blow, leaving the Luftwaffe stretched thin and disoriented. At briefing, crews crowded into damp Quonset huts, the smell of coffee mixing with oil and sweat. A large map stretched across the wall, marked with red strings threading deep into the heart of Germany. A young intelligence officer spoke clearly. "Gentlemen, this one will be tough. Expect heavy resistance." They all knew what that meant. No escort fighters would reach them beyond Aachen. Once over Germany, they would be on their own. 4 hours of flying through enemy territory, 600 miles in and out with the full weight of the Luftwaffe waiting. Still, morale was high. By mid-1943, the crews had faith in their machines and in each other. Many of them had survived dozens of missions. Some were new, their confidence untested. Yet all understood the stakes. Schweinfurt was the nerve center of Germany's precision engineering, its ball bearings essential for tanks, trucks, and aircraft alike. If the fortresses could destroy it, the German war effort would stagger. At 08:00, the first bombers lifted off from the runways. The rising sun glinted off silver fuselages painted with names, Knockout Dropper, Hell's Angels, and Shoo Shoo Baby. They climbed slowly, forming into tight, layered formations. By 09 hundreds of B-17s filled the sky, an airborne armada moving east. Below, English farmers stopped their work to watch the procession. The sight of the fortresses, dozens abreast, wings shining like blades, had become familiar but never ordinary. As the bombers crossed the North Sea, the air grew thin and brittle. Inside the cabins, frost formed on oxygen masks and gun barrels. The intercoms crackled with clipped chatter. Navigators checked bearings, adjusting for crosswinds. Pilots watched fuel gauges nervously. Any error in consumption could mean drifting too far from home. At 10:20, radar operators in Holland picked up the formations. Alarms blared along the coast. Luftwaffe fighter controllers scrambled interceptors from bases at Leeuwarden, Venlo, and Münster. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs and Focke-Wulf 190As clawed into the sky. Within minutes, German pilots could see them, vast columns of bombers glinting against the sun, their contrails etching white scars across the blue. To many it was a staggering sight. They came like a steel river, one German flyer recalled later. You could see the light flashing from their wings even at 20 kilometers. The first attacks began over Aachen. The Germans came in head-on, exactly as doctrine demanded. They flew through their own cannon shells, firing in bursts of half a second before peeling away. To the gunners inside the fortresses, the sky became a kaleidoscope of flashes, cannon fire, tracer lines, and exploding aircraft. Inside Miss Wachita, waist gunner Sergeant Raymond Munro braced against the shock of each burst. It felt like the air itself was breaking apart, he later wrote. Pieces of a nearby bomber spun past, yet their formation held. The 91st, 303rd, and 379th bomb groups pressed on toward Schweinfurt. Radio silence was strict. Formation discipline was absolute. Even as fortresses fell, burning through the clouds, the rest tightened their spacing, filling the gaps as if by instinct. By 11:30, they were 250 miles inside Germany. Flak over Koblenz and Frankfurt filled the sky with black bursts. Pilots described it as flying through a furnace. Shrapnel ripped through aluminum skins, severed cables, and pierced fuel tanks. Yet the fortresses endured. The Luftwaffe intensified its assault. Groups of 20 to 30 fighters attacked in waves, slashing in from above and behind. The bombers' defensive fire created a deadly web. German pilots began to fall. Some struck head-on by concentrated fire from multiple aircraft. Others collided in the chaos, the air littered with debris and smoke. Despite mounting losses, the American formations pressed forward, guided by their navigators and faith in the plan. At 12:15, they reached Schweinfurt. Below lay the city's industrial sprawl, the massive Kugelfischer and SKF factories glistening beside the main river. Bomb bay doors opened in unison. The lead bombardiers steadied the crosshairs of their Norden sights, adjusting for wind and drift. The order came through. Bombs away. Tons of high explosives tumbled downward, each casing slicing through the air with an audible whine. Seconds later, the city vanished beneath waves of orange flame and black smoke. Shockwaves rocked the bombers as they turned for home. But the mission wasn't over. Ahead lay 400 miles of enemy territory and the full fury of the Luftwaffe's return strikes. The Germans, humiliated by the sight of their factories burning, rallied every available fighter for the chase. The sky behind the retreating bombers darkened with interceptors. The fortress crews reloaded their guns, braced their nerves, and prepared for the longest flight of their lives. The next phase would turn the mission from triumph to ordeal, a battle not just for victory, but for survival. The moment the bomb bay doors closed, the second half of the battle began. Behind them, Schweinfurt was a sea of fire. Warehouses engulfed, the ball-bearing factories torn open, and machinery mangled and scattered across the valley. But the German response was swift and merciless. Within minutes, radar operators had vectored dozens more fighters onto the retreating bombers' path. To the Americans, the homeward flight felt like an eternity. They had expected resistance on the way in, but not this storm of vengeance on the way out. At 12:45, as the fortresses leveled off and turned west, Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Focke-Wulf 190s rose from airfields near Würzburg and Gießen. These were not green recruits. Many were Expert-10, aces hardened by years of combat over France and Russia. They came in pairs, weaving through the smoke trails of burning bombers. The Germans had studied the fortress for months, learning to exploit its weaknesses. They targeted the cockpit, engines, and fuel tanks. But in the chaos of battle, those tactics met the fortress-like reality of the B-17's design. Machine guns opened up in all directions. Twin 50-caliber turrets poured out red-hot streams of lead. Waist gunners yelled warnings into their headsets. Bandits 9 o'clock low, while tracers laced through the air like molten threads. Inside Delta Rebel 2, top turret gunner Sergeant Billy Little fired until the barrels of his guns glowed dull orange. They just kept coming, he remembered later. You'd see one burst into smoke, another take its place, and another right behind that. German pilots who had once laughed at the B-17's bulky frame now faced its fury firsthand. Many underestimated the sheer volume of defensive fire, the intricate web of interlocking fields that could shred an attacking aircraft before it even reached firing range. One FW-190 dived straight toward the Careful Virgin, a bomber from the 92nd Bomb Group. The pilot's 20mm cannon spat fire, but seconds before impact, his engine burst into flames. The fortress didn't flinch. Its wings, scarred and torn, still held formation. By 1330, more than 100 German fighters had joined the assault. They struck from above, below, and head-on. Each attack wave tested the endurance of the American crews. Fuel leaks froze into silver ribbons across the wings. Wounded men were pulled away from their guns, replaced by others still firing through tears and blood. The sky was chaos, a moving battlefield of smoke, falling debris, and burning metal. Yet amid the destruction, a strange rhythm persisted. Each surviving fortress maintained its position. Each formation kept its shape. The discipline drilled into them over months of practice now became their salvation. Inside the Memphis Belle's sister ship, Hell's Angels, pilot Robert Morgan gritted his teeth as flak burst close enough to rattle his teeth. His co-pilot read off fuel pressures while the engineer rerouted power to a damaged engine. The aircraft lurched, steadied, and stayed in line. The Germans were furious. From the ground, civilians and soldiers watched as the bombers, crippled and smoking, refused to fall. Reports later described the sight as unreal, like giant metal birds that could not die. At 14 the Luftwaffe made one last coordinated strike, a head-on attack by elements of Jagdgeschwader 3 and JG-26, numbering nearly 60 fighters. They came in a wall of speed and flame, determined to shatter the formation once and for all. But the Americans were ready. Every turret, every gunner, and every last ounce of ammunition was focused forward. The sky exploded with intersecting tracers. 4 German fighters disintegrated in mid-air before they even closed the distance. Another 2 collided, trying to evade. The rest scattered. The fortress line kept moving, slower now, lower, but unbroken. By the time they crossed back into Allied-controlled airspace, only fragments of the original formation remained. Dozens of bombers were gone, hundreds of men missing, yet impossibly enough had survived to bring back proof of their mission. At Bassingbourn and Kimballton, ground crews stared in disbelief as the first survivors returned. Engines were shot through, fuselages shredded. One fortress landed with half its tail missing. Another touched down with one wheel and a single functioning engine. Yet they had made it home. A gunner stepped out, his face blackened with soot, his hands trembling. He didn't speak. He just looked up at his aircraft, patched with holes but still standing, and shook his head slowly. "How did she keep flying?" he whispered. That question echoed across airfields all over England that night. The flying fortress had proven its name beyond all doubt. A fortress in the sky, battered but unbroken. Its survival changed everything. For the first time, even the Germans began to realize that brute force alone wouldn't stop these machines. Something about the American bombers, their construction, their formation discipline, their sheer will to endure, was redefining air warfare itself. The mission to Schweinfurt was a costly lesson. 60 bombers were lost. 600 men didn't return. But the factories they destroyed would cripple German production for months, and the legend of the fortress would grow into an unshakable myth among friend and foe alike. The battle over Schweinfurt had shown the world that courage, precision, and design could stand against impossible odds and still fly home. When the last B-17 touched down that evening, the airfields of East Anglia fell silent. Engines sputtered to a stop one by one, replaced by the sound of wind moving through shredded aluminum and torn canvas. Men walked slowly between the smoking aircraft, counting holes, scanning for faces that would never return. The mission to Schweinfurt and Regensburg had ended, but its cost had only begun to sink in. Of the 376 bombers that had taken off that morning, 60 were lost outright, and more than 100 returned so damaged they would never fly again. Nearly 600 American airmen were dead or missing, most of them captured after parachuting into enemy territory. The figures stunned the 8th Air Force staff. Never before had such losses been sustained in a single daylight operation. At debriefing, exhausted crews slumped over tables, faces gray from oxygen deprivation and fear. Intelligence officers moved quietly among them, gathering accounts, sketching attack patterns, and marking where formations had collapsed. The tone was somber but resolute. They had struck deep into Germany and survived long enough to prove it could be done. Meanwhile, the Germans were also taking stock. In Schweinfurt, the fires still burned. Entire districts lay in ruins. The Kugelfischer and SKF ball-bearing factories, though not completely destroyed, were crippled. Machinery lay twisted under collapsed roofs. Production had slowed to a crawl. German industry officials reported immediate shortages, not just in tanks and aircraft, but in the simple bearings used in every vehicle and gun. The effects rippled outward, tightening the noose around Germany's logistical chain. And yet, for both sides, the mission became a paradox, a victory paid for with blood. In London, Allied command celebrated the precision and bravery of the attack, but could not ignore the cost. The numbers were stark. If every deep strike exacted this price, the daylight bombing campaign might collapse under its own weight. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, confided to his staff, "We can't afford another Schweinfurt." The press, however, told a different story. In American newspapers, headlines read, "Flying fortresses blast Germany's war heart." Photos showed smiling crews standing before battered bombers riddled with holes, proof of both triumph and resilience. To the public, it was the embodiment of courage. To the men who had flown it, it was survival by miracle. Engineers at Boeing and Wright Field pored over the damaged aircraft as soon as they returned. They studied every bullet hole, every engine failure, every near miss. What they found reinforced what many already suspected. The B-17's durability was extraordinary. One fortress fortress had returned with its tail nearly severed, another with an engine completely destroyed and half its control surfaces gone. Yet they flew home. Those battered aircraft became classrooms. Crews learned new tactics for defensive fire, tighter formations, and coordinated coverage. Armor plating was reinforced in critical areas. Fuel tanks were redesigned to self-seal more effectively. The experience would evolve into what historians later called the fortress doctrine, a belief that discipline, precision, and machine resilience could overcome superior numbers. But morale was shaken. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the ready rooms was subdued. Men stared at the empty bunks in the barracks, the unclaimed gear still hanging on pegs. Some wrote letters home that night, describing the mission in quiet understatement. Others simply sat on the wings of their aircraft, staring across the English countryside, lost in thought. For the first time, whispers began to spread that perhaps daylight bombing over deep Germany was suicide without long-range escort. The P-47 Thunderbolts and Spitfires could protect them only part way. The rest of the route remained a death zone. Still, no one spoke openly of retreat. The 8th Air Force had been forged in the belief that precision bombing, not terror raids, but calculated daylight strikes, could cripple the Nazi war machine. Schweinfurt proved it could work. The question was whether it could be done again, and at what cost. In that quiet moment after the smoke cleared, the men of the fortresses waited for orders, knowing that history was already calling them back into the sky. The mission to Schweinfurt marked a crossroads, not just for the men who flew it, but for the entire Allied air strategy. In the days that followed, as reports reached Washington and London, a hard truth settled in. The flying fortress was extraordinary, but not invincible. The statistics told a brutal story. The 8th Air Force had lost nearly 1 in every 5 bombers that took off that morning. That ratio, if repeated, would make sustained daylight bombing impossible. General Hap Arnold, chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces, reviewed the figures in silence before saying, "We've proven our point. Now we must find a way to survive it." That search began immediately. The Schweinfurt mission forced a complete reassessment of escort tactics, fighter range, and bomber strategy. Engineers at North American Aviation accelerated work on a radical new solution, the P-51 Mustang with a long-range drop tank. Within months, it would become the fortress's guardian angel. But in late 1943, such salvation still lay in the future. For now, the 8th Air Force paused deep penetration raids, shifting to shorter escorted strikes until new fighters arrived. It was a quiet admission of reality and a testament to the lesson written in the smoke above Schweinfurt. In Germany, the aftermath was equally revealing. Though the factories were not completely destroyed, the psychological effect was enormous. The Germans had long believed their industrial heartland safe by day, beyond the reach of enemy bombers. Schweinfurt shattered that illusion. Even as production resumed, the Reich's air defense network was forced to expand, diverting resources from the Eastern Front. New radar installations, flak batteries, and fighter wings were deployed across central Germany, thinning defenses elsewhere. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later wrote, "For the first time, we realized that no target was beyond the enemy's reach. Even in daylight, the Americans could strike wherever they wished." Factories began dispersing into rural areas, and production split into smaller workshops hidden in forests and caves. The decentralization slowed output, but it made direct destruction harder. It was a strategic shift born of fear, the same fear inspired by the slow, relentless advance of the Silver Fortresses. Back in England, the story of the B-17's endurance grew into legend. Photographs of returning aircraft circulated through Allied newspapers, wings torn open, tails shredded, yet still on their landing gear. One image of a B-17 with half its nose blown away and its crew alive and smiling became an icon of American resolve. The German fighter pilots, too, developed a grudging respect. Many referred to the B-17 as das fliegende Stachelschwein, the flying porcupine. They had learned the hard way that every approach toward one meant facing a storm of interlocking fire from every direction. Historians would later argue that Schweinfurt was both a failure and a triumph. A failure because of its devastating losses, a triumph because it proved the theory of precision bombing, that industrial warfare could be fought from the air, with technology and discipline replacing sheer numbers. In a strange way, both sides learned the same lesson that day. Endurance could shape strategy as much as destruction. When the P-51 Mustang finally entered combat escorting the fortresses months later, the equation changed. The same missions that had once been massacres now became hammer blows. The combined reach of the fortress and the Mustang brought daylight to every corner of the Reich. By 1944, Schweinfurt would be bombed again, and this time, with fighter cover and refined tactics, the results would be decisive. German ball-bearing production collapsed for good, crippling their tank and aircraft industries. And yet, among veterans of the 8th Air Force, it was that first raid, the one fought without escorts, against impossible odds, that remained the defining memory. They had proven something more enduring than metal or machinery. That courage, discipline, and faith in one another could hold a formation together, even when everything else fell apart. As one pilot later said, staring at the battered wing of his fortress before takeoff on his next mission, "We fly again not because we forget Schweinfurt, but because we remember it." The silence that followed spoke more than any speech or medal could. In the calm after the storm, the legend of the flying fortress became something more than a weapon. It became a symbol, not not of destruction, but of endurance. The men who climbed into those aluminum giants were not mythic heroes. They were young, often frightened, and painfully aware of how fragile life was at 30,000 feet. Each mission was a test of nerve, of discipline, of faith that their machine and their comrades would hold together long enough to see home again. What made the B-17 unique was not just its engineering, but the way it embodied an idea that human courage, multiplied by precision and purpose, could resist even the most formidable enemy. Every bolt, every rivet, every sheet of aluminum represented that fragile alliance between man and machine, the belief that technology could carry resolve through the fire. Schweinfurt was not remembered for its victory, but for its endurance. The mission's true legacy lay in the quiet strength of those who flew it, and in the understanding that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep flying through it. The bombers that limped back to England that evening were more than aircraft. They were monuments in motion, testaments to the endurance of the human spirit. They bore the scars of war not as signs of defeat, but as proof of survival. In the years that followed, the lessons of Schweinfurt would echo across every battlefield and every cockpit. Engineers would design stronger wings, strategists would plan smarter missions, and future generations would look to those images, the torn, smoking fortresses against a sunlit sky, and understand what it truly meant to hold the line. The flying fortress had done more than drop bombs. It had proven that the will to endure could outlast fear, that steel and spirit could merge into something unbreakable, and that sometimes victory is measured not in what is destroyed, but in what refuses to fall. And so the story of Schweinfurt and the men who flew through it remains not a tale of conquest, but of courage. The day the fortress would not fall became the day its legend began.